Well, the death of George Floyd shifting the focus off of COVID-19 almost instantly, but the coronavirus is still lingering, if you haven't noticed, across the U.S. It's placing protesters in a precarious position, either remain silent on police brutality or risk contracting COVID-19. Others are highlighting the contradictory enforcement of the lockdown, noting that the rioters are getting a free pass. Business owners are left questioning leaders, asking why large crowds are suddenly okay for protests but not for business. For more on how leaders are sending mixed signals, let's bring in Siraj Hashmi. He's a commentary video editor and writer for the Washington Examiner. And Siraj, 3 weeks ago, you had these governors and these mayors saying that the protesters who were, protesting the lockdown were grandma killers. And now suddenly the protesters are doing all the right things.
It's absolutely mind-boggling, Trace, to think that we were less than a month ago. You had public officials, governors, mayors, what have you, basically decrying anyone who wanted to reopen their businesses to try to get back to a sense of normal when the coronavirus numbers in those particular regions weren't nearly as bad. And now, obviously, with the protests of happening in the wake of George Floyd's death, it's like coronavirus never happened. And it's amazing to think that now, all of a sudden, while protesting is a fundamental American right, the right to assemble, and it is a virtuous and noble cause to combat police brutality, to demand more police accountability. But it's absolutely stunning to think that many of the people who are now protesting seem to now operate in a vacuum where the risk of coronavirus seems to have just gone away.
Yeah, and we've had numerous guests on the past several nights saying, look, the coronavirus is out there. And some of these political leaders are saying, if you are out in these protests, just assume that you have it, get tested, act like you have it, maybe quarantine. I want to play this. It's not actually sound. It's a full screen from New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy, because he's one, 3 weeks ago called the protesters jerks. And he was asked about that, the hypocrisy of the lockdown protesters versus these protesters. And he said, and I'm quoting here, it's one thing to protest what day nail salons are opening, and it's another to come out in peaceful protest overwhelmingly about somebody who was murdered right before our eyes. And he's right. The George Floyd incident was awful. But he is kind of, he's just dismissing the fact that we had millions of businesses who were desperate and losing livelihoods, and people who lost everything in this shutdown were arguing to open this country back up. So to say, it's nail salons versus is somewhat, as social media has noted, is somewhat disingenuous. Your thoughts?
100%. The thing is, and when you look at what's happening right now, at least a lot of these unemployment benefits that have gone to the millions of Americans who are now unemployed from the coronavirus pandemic, that's going at least till July 31st. And for those people who are now out on the streets, who probably, as Andrew Cuomo said, assume that you already have coronavirus, that's 20,000 protesters in New York City who are protesting. And New York City is pretty much ground zero for the coronavirus in the United States. They've been hit really hard. And people also ignore the fact that people of color, namely the Black community and Hispanics, have been hit harder by the coronavirus pandemic, have experienced more deaths, more cases. And it's a vicious cycle right here. You're having more people being exposed to coronavirus. And frankly, it's unfair. It's also exposes how our healthcare system has a systemic racism problem, because all of a sudden you have public health experts having a different opinion about protests happening now. But when it was protests at state capitals to reopen the economies, somehow that was shameful and abhorrent.
Yeah, and a lot of people have pointed out that nobody's really apologizing to Georgia Governor Brian Kemp, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. There were people who were saying that these governors were sacrificing humans by opening up their states earlier than the rest of the country. Well, it hasn't worked out that way. Florida and Georgia have actually flattened their curve, and the numbers show they're doing quite well on this. But nobody's come out and said, maybe we got that wrong. Maybe we should relook at how states are opening, and these might be examples.
I think it's sort of, to take a 10,000-foot look view here, it's sort of suspect and strange that as soon as everything starts tampering down, The curve has been flattened. States, all 50 states, by the time the protests started, were reopening their economies in some aspect or some way, shape, or form. All of a sudden, you have these protests, you have these riots, you have looting, you have violence and casualties on both sides, and it's only going to create another spike in coronavirus. You don't know how bad it is. We can't obviously tell how badly it's going to get. Obviously, the next 2 weeks will show us a lot, but it's certainly strange to see that. I would say that the one particular thing that people have been criticizing President Trump is that he's trying to wage a war against Americans. He's in control right now. There's no benefit, there's no upside to him trying to wage war on Americans. It actually, if you look at the political benefit here, it benefits the opposition party, Democrats who want to get control because things are so bad right now.
Yeah, we've talked about New York Governor Andrew Cuomo a couple of times here, Siraj. I want to play the soundbite and then have you respond on the flip side.
If you were at a protest, go get a test, please. The protesters have a civic duty here also. With the protesters, they could actually compound the situation. Why? You have 30,000 people who've been protesting statewide. You look at the video as well as I look at the video. Many of them wear masks, thank God. But there's no social distancing.
Yeah, we should note coming out of that soundbite that Governor Cuomo was very hard on those who were fighting to open businesses back up and much more lenient on those who were protesting the death of George Floyd.
But I will say this, Andrew Cuomo he was harsher on the protesters than a lot of these public health officials have been. And that is stunning right there, to consider that public health officials are now basically becoming political pawns and using their expertise to sort of speak out against racism and say that racism is actually more life-threatening than the coronavirus. Well, I mean, how are you really going to compare the two? They're two completely separate things. And when we're looking at this particular instance, the thing is, public health experts are ruining their credibility here. They're making themselves to be completely delegitimized by speaking out against one particular protest, but not speaking out against the other. And with Andrew Cuomo, to get back to your question, Andrew Cuomo has a lot of blood on his hands, given the fact that when he initially had the coronavirus infecting a number of New Yorkers, millions of tens of thousands of New Yorkers, he had that stay order in place that sent patients who were infected with coronavirus to nursing homes, and over 5,000 people died as a result.
You sent hundreds and thousands of people back to these nursing homes, and a lot of governors in other states said, nope, we're not going to do that. We're not sending them back. Siraj Hashmi, good to see you, sir. Thank you for your time.
Appreciate it, Trace.